AI is definitely playing a role in cyber attacks. It's playing a role in phishing. It's playing a role in the sophistication of the attacks that we're seeing. And because of that, there's a real demand to get ahead of the curve on how do you protect against AI-driven cyber attacks and what do you do in the AI world.
If you're making technology decisions that impact people, budgets, and outcomes, you're in the right place. Welcome to Insight On, the podcast for leaders who need technology to deliver real results. No fluff, no filler. Just the insight you need before your next big decision. Hi, I'm your host, Jillian Viner, and I am so pleased to be back in the studio with my co-host, Jeremy Hodge.
Glad to be back.
So this is our final episode of the season. Kind of sad, but we've got such great stuff cooking for January. Let's dive in.
There's a lot of promise with AI. We're all really excited about it, but it's not without its risks. We know that there is an increased risk of threat actors using AI for cyber threats. We also know that governance is super important. So today we're going to talk about everything from emerging cybersecurity threats. What are some considerations in terms of governance? So it's a really interesting discussion. And I think actually, despite all the scary things that are out there, there's a lot of opportunity still.
Yeah, and I would say probably the biggest takeaway at the end of this episode is if your organization has maybe freezed any decisions about AI or put a halt on it because of those security or compliance risks, this should actually give you some confidence and some answers to go ahead and give things a green light safely.
Exactly. I want to start with the conversation I had with Atkinson from Commvault, who really laid out what's happening now with cybersecurity and AI and what are some of those emerging threats.
These days, the story is all around cyber resilience, and you're beginning to see a heavy AI coloring to that. Now let me explain what that is, because I'm not going to tell you that we're AI washing everything and we've reborn as an AI company. But AI is definitely playing a role in cyber attacks. It's playing a role in phishing. It's playing a role in the sophistication of the attacks that we're seeing. And because of that, there's a real demand to get ahead of the curve on how do you protect against AI-driven cyber attacks and what do you do in the AI world. I can probably elaborate on that endlessly, but our company, I think, has had a tremendous amount of momentum over the last couple of years, and it's largely been fueled by this, unfortunately, this rise of ransomware, malware, and cyber attacks, and people have really re-examined their strategy from whatever they had before that may have been, a fine tool to recover file systems and databases, but not so fine to recover against the cyber attack.
So stopping every attack is, I'm pretty sure, impossible, right? So how do you operationalize that cyber resilience in your organization?
I'd like to tell you we've got the cure for that, or someone has the cure for that. They don't.
Yeah.
And in that world, if you plan for, I'm going to get penetrated at some point, what you want to do is be ready. And I think we have the technology for the fastest cyber recovery available and the ability to test your strategy for that. So one of the things that we tell customers is you've really got to be prepared. And prepared means that you've got to test your recovery plan, you've got to know that it works. And things like our clean room, which has been a very popular offering, allows customers to do that. The ability to find how to recover, and let me just explain what that means for a second.
Yeah.
So, in traditional data protection, you would hear things like recovery point, or RTO, recovery time objective. In a cyber attack, those things really don't have any meaning, because what tends to happen is the bad guys get into your system early. They don't do anything right away. Well, they do things, but nothing obvious. They're watching, they're looking at what they can penetrate, they're usually messing with your Active Directory or Entra ID, and then over time, they'll do whatever they're going to do, and sometimes they're really insidious. They'll put additional backdoors in, so if you close one, they have another. They'll exfiltrate data in some cases, they'll encrypt things in other cases, maybe they do all of the above. And so the trick is, where do you recover to? Because in a large company, you probably have some files in the cloud, you have files on databases, you maybe have tens of thousands of VMs and potentially billions of files. And how do you figure out what's the last known good recovery point? Because there's probably not a single one. That requires really quite different technology. And so things like our synthetic recovery that allow you to find the last known good copy of something on a very granular basis so you can recover the most recent version of everything that's good and known good is really a tremendous advance in hardening your environment against the bad guys, which, by the way, still doesn't eliminate the need for testing.
Right. And it's not just, I guess, humans who are doing the attacks, but AI is being used for these attacks too, right?
Increasingly. In fact, it's funny you mentioned that. Just literally Monday, I got an email from a customer that had been the subject, thankfully unsuccessful attack, but they had seen, it's really the first time I can remember seeing it at this volume, a very high volume, very sophisticated AI-driven cyber attack. And I think you're going to see more and more and more of that.
Alan hit on, I think, so many points that have a lot of security people nervous about AI. And in fact, in some of our research, we found that some organizations are withholding any AI integration into their company because of those security concerns. And it does beg the question, what's the more or least risk adverse thing to do, to ban AI or to move ahead with AI? And so when we had the opportunity to ask two security experts that question, it was really interesting to hear their responses.
So here's how I would answer that. And I don't know if it's as binary as maybe it sounded at first. Because I honestly look at it through like the lens of a spectrum. Because I think you've got organizations that are extremely risk averse, where, like you said, straight up ban, no consumption, we're not using AI. We are not an AI company, it's too risky. For whatever that reason might be, we are not going to consume any AI services. But then you've got the polar opposite of people who are like wild, wild west, AI being consumed everywhere, no monitoring, no management, no consideration for data consumption, how things are being learned into these models, how they're being shared to other various different third parties, right? So two very different ends of that spectrum. I think, in my opinion, both of them run the exact same risk as an organization, like as far as like viability and sustainability as an organization but it's just for different reasons. Like if you're drawing a hard line and basically saying thou shalt not consume AI, like you're going to be out innovated, and your competitors are going to lean in, maybe not much more than you, but any little bit more than nothing is going to give them an efficiency and a competitive advantage above you. So you run the risk of basically viability in the marketplace. But if you run the other side, and then you're one data breach away, one very public event of representation that your data or your corporate assets have been shared, and whether that's through intellectual property leakage, whether that's through customer data that's inappropriately shared, and potentially compliance risks that come along with that.
So there's some organizations that have just said, we're going to ban AI. We don't think it's safe. What's your take on organizations that are doing that and their security teams? And is there advice you'd give them on a better approach that they can safely adopt AI?
Well, I could certainly understand that approach. I think it's a bit extreme. New technologies have emerged throughout history, and there's almost always been a case to ban calculators from the classroom when they first came out, or ban the internet for using certain things. And while I do think there needs to be an abundance of caution around AI, and we've outlined some of the things that I think you need to look out for there, and I think you can make a very solid case of going slow. And I don't want to speak to specific businesses because one size doesn't fit all here, right? So what might be right for one business is potentially totally wrong for another business. But I think there are guardrails you can put up around AI. I think using commercial licenses as opposed to free versions of things. I think taking a close look at what are you allowing agents in your environment to do, and maybe the answer is nothing. You're not ready for that yet. But saying that I'm not going to allow you to use ChatGPT or Gemini or Copilot to help solve a problem, I think is potentially just hurting productivity among your workforce. Now, again, I don't want to speak to specifics, and there may be good reasons for some of those prohibitions, but I think there are proper ways to use those, and I think there are proper ways to do that with a degree of safety, and actually a high degree of safety.
Got it. So even for the most cautious organizations, there's a path forward they can take.
In my opinion, and I always hesitate to say without exception, because maybe there's some cases I hadn't hadn't thought of that are highly surrounded by security that needs to be off the charts. But in general, I think a total ban on AI is a bit draconian.
I love what Jeremy said in terms of banning AI outright is just as bad as just unencumbered embracement of it, right? If you're just letting people run wild, use whatever they want, you expose all those data risks. But the reality is, if you ban it, you are going to be outgunned by your competitors. You're going to get behind on innovation. So coming from our own CISO, who's acknowledging that, I think is really powerful and shows us you don't want to ban it. You actually need to embrace it, but do it securely.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Alan very much supported that perspective. He made the point about new technologies always coming into environments, causing a little bit of alarm, causing some concern. But all you can do is figure out what's the safe way to proceed at a pace that you feel comfortable with, where you can control things. But you're right, you can't just put a ban on it and act like it's not there. You won't win that way.
Right. So if we're not going to ban it, we still need some guardrails. We need some sort of governance. So I talked to Mike Morgan, who talked about all the different levels of AI projects that we have and how we should think about that governance in a more agile way.
Yeah, I think it depends where you are in the maturity cycle of an organization's adoption of AI. It's, again, like cloud, it's a super broad term. When you say AI, to one person, they think Microsoft Copilot or ChatGPT, and it's a chat-based assistant to help you with your personal productivity. You talk to a developer, and AI is about new ways of developing things, new ways of automating or turning on its head inside out processes and systems that are deep inside the organization, and they're all in the category of AI, but the governance required for those extreme edges is extremely different. So if you're running a project to try to get better usage out of personal productivity tools, taking a big kind of highfalutin governance approach to that with massive steering committees and too many stakeholders can slow you down, not speed you up. You need to have much more of an agile approach where you're enabling people to engage in the technology and see what benefits they can find for themselves without having to have senior people defining those use cases up front. So the experimentation, the sandboxing it requires a different type of governance and a different type of kind of trust, and not trying to define the outcome too prescriptively just to get things moving. On the flip side, if you're at the other end of the edge case, if you're starting to use AI to change things that are core in the depths of your systems and your processes, that needs a different level of governance. And you need to make sure that the people involved are the people that either have the opportunity in the business process to be evolved, or the people who have the risk in the business process that's about to be changed. And that's no different to any other project that's touched by technology, that at the end of the day, the technology is never the risk or the opportunity, it's the embedding of the technology in a meaningful way into the business itself.
It sounds like a bit of a security nightmare to do all this experimentation. So how do you best manage that?
Yeah, I think and we've had an approach to this, not unique to AI. We think that security is not something that sits off to the side that specialists focus on. We think security needs to be in the mindset and the toolbox of every person who touches anything in the technology space. And AI is even more consistent with that. One of the things that we love about being so deep in the Microsoft ecosystem at Insight and APAC is that Microsoft uniquely has AI built inside the secure environment of its own platforms. So we see things like Copilot Chat, Copilot more broadly, as being such a logical choice for our customers to be able to have the peace of mind that when you're allowing your employees to experiment with data using AI, you're doing it in a way that they're not pushing corporate information and corporate secrets out into publicly accessible large language models where inadvertently you start having very sensitive IP that's out there training the language models of the world. And I think a lot of our clients underestimate how dangerous that can actually be. So we think that by having a secured internal environment that's able to, you get two advantages actually. With Copilot, you're training, the models are being trained on your corporate data, which makes the actual efficacy of the investment significantly higher. And secondly, because it's doing it within that secure environment, you can be fairly assured that the things that you're doing are for internal purposes. You can apply it to the data that makes most sense. And of course, like anything in IT, the most impactful information that you can have inside your organization that really makes the difference is your secret sauce. And so if you're going to start applying for the best results, you need to be able to access that in a secure way and have the peace of mind that that's not going to float out into the ether.
One of the big catalysts right now for all of this governance and thinking about security is agents and agentic AI, which is a huge focus at this conference.
Oh, absolutely. If you think back to a year ago, the phrase on everybody's lips was generative AI. That's been the phrase for a couple of years now. Today, it's agentic AI. The fact that Microsoft is releasing Agent 365 is a really big signal to organizations that if agentic AI is not on your roadmap, it absolutely needs to be. And now is the time. And I think this is an instance that should give, leaders a little bit of not comfort per se, but some confidence as they move forward with their AI strategies. The fact that Microsoft is already thinking ahead for you with the identities piece. What I mean by identities is that when you are building your fleet of agents, so these are basically little AI bots that live within your organization that become part of your teams, there is a security component to that. There has to be. These agents are going to have access to your data, to your files, to your CMS, right? And so the way that Microsoft, I think, is positioning this should give some confidence to how you approach that, because it's all going to be contained. The governance is sort of built in, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, and I can't think of the last time a technology had an identity. This feels like a unique challenge that we have to address. And I'm glad we had both Alan and Jeremy's take on this agentic identity and what it means for how we need to think about managing these agents.
I was thinking about that very point, and one of the things that, particularly when you get into agentic AI, so you're beginning to hear conversations moving from sort of basic chat bots and what can an LLM spit out and what can I use to leverage it, into agentic AI, where you've got really a whole lot of automation that leans on underlying LLMs and what's going on there. And one of the things I think that has to be considered is you've got to treat these agents like people. And what I mean by that is, if it's Alan Atkinson, right, that's the person, I have permissions. I have certain things that I can view. I've got identity access management all over the place. Well, agents need that too. And if you begin by thinking as you write your agents, what is that agent allowed to see? What are the entitlements? Almost the way that you would do a user, hopefully with a very contained set of permissions as to what they can do with all of the things that go around identity access management for humans and employees. I think that's something to really consider as these things get designed. And I'll add into that auditing. So understanding what does the agent do and when did it do it, and ideally why, although that's a harder problem.
What's the identity? What's the identity context for those? What's the life cycle associated with those identities? And, are you doing FinOps off of identity services? Identities aren't free. Or I shouldn't even say accounts aren't free. And so, and then the concept of even deeper, what is an identity? So I even brought this up in my session as I was presenting, is when you say identity, what do you first think of? What's the first thing that comes to your mind? If I say identity services.
In the work complex, I think about my email address.
Your email address, right?
Yeah.
Yes, and lots of people think about, when I talk about, agentic AI, when we're talking about agentic identity, what does that usually mean? Username and password. When people think, my identity is, especially in the context of IT, it's my username and password, maybe MFA associated with that, right? And, when in reality, that's just authentication. That's just a way of proving your identity in this digital space. But your identity is a series of other data points and elements that make up a picture of who you are. And that picture is then used for granting you access to various different technology systems, data sets, things of that nature. And so it's really the username and password is a way of protecting that contextualized data about what your identity is. And so just kind of exploring, what do these mean? In the world of agentic AI, and especially as we start to get into the conversation of agents that create agents, what does that start to look like? So, you talk about borrowed identity. I'm sitting here, I'm creating an agent. I want to go off and do this thing, but it needs to be able to have access to the same systems and data sets that I have. And so I'm going to lend it my identity. What's the lease of that lent identity? How do you reclaim that? How do you monitor to make sure that it gets effectively reclaimed? Anyway, I could go on and on for days. But those have been some really kind of insightful and fun conversations I've been having. Do I have all the answers? Absolutely not. I think it's something that we're still exploring. We're still trying to understand.
So it's really interesting to hear this concept of agents and identity access management, how we need to factor that. Describing them almost like a human employee with a badge number. So one of those things I think is going to be really interesting to watch going forward. And again, one of those new challenges that we'll need to work through as we adopt AI. As I think back on everything we heard today, a couple things stand out. One is we know that AI is increasing cyber threats and that bad actors are using it in new ways to drive new attacks. But you can't just ban AI. If you do, it's almost worse because you're going to get out-innovated. In some ways, the threat actors may get ahead of you. So you need to embrace it. But the good news is you can use guardrails. There's governance principles that you can apply to do this effectively and responsibly. And we heard about this new paradigm of agents and identity access management. So one of those new things that we need to be aware of as we manage AI and think about how to roll it out responsibly. And I'm sure there'll be more things to come in the year ahead.
So out of everything that we heard from our leaders from Microsoft, what was your biggest takeaway from Ignite?
I think the biggest takeaway for me at Ignite was, while we were talking a lot about AI, so many of the core principles of technology and change is really what we were talking about. Whether that's think about your existing systems and how you integrate them, or that's how security matters, or starting with your use cases, culture. You could argue every shift we've had. If we were doing this back in the late 90s and having a discussion about the internet and the World Wide Web, there'd probably be some similar principles. So yes, there's this whole new frontier. There's so much excitement with AI. But the principles of good business, of technology strategy remain true.
We captured so much great insight from leaders from Microsoft, from Insights, from some of our partners. Obviously could not fit all of that into these 2 episodes. So we are going to share some of those great clips across our YouTube, Instagram, and LinkedIn channels. So make sure you give us a follow there. And I'm a little bit sad to say that this is our final episode of 2025. We're going to take a little break for the holidays, but we have some really great episodes coming out that'll be ready for you in January. We've got some clients coming to the pod, some more experts to talk about the latest trends in esports, more security conversations, because that's not going anywhere. So if you haven't subscribed already, please do. And we will see you in the new year.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Insight On. If today's conversation sparked an idea or raised a challenge you're facing, head to insight.com. You'll find the resources, case studies, and real-world solutions to help you lead with clarity. If you found this episode to be helpful, be sure to follow Insight On, leave a review, and share it with a colleague. It's how we grow the conversation and help more leaders make better tech decisions. Discover more at insight.com. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are of those of the host and the guests and do not necessarily reflect on the official policy or position of Insight or its affiliates. This content is for informational purposes only and should not be considered as professional or legal advice.